Right. So, very first ORP Indie Comics Reviews episode. Today, Today we're going to be talking about Evoluzione Publishing's 2021 title Warbound #1, Tales of a Madman. Warbound was created by Marcel Dupree with the story by Dupree and the scripter letterer Guido Martinez. The cover and interior artwork was done by Gaurav Shrivastav, and the colors by Fahriza Kamaputra. They have a Kickstarter for Warbound #4 coming on June #8, and you'll find that link in the description below for notification sign up. It's also in the comments there. But before we get into the review, I think you had something you wanted to say there, Steve.
Sure. Warbound was a book I was curious about for a few reasons. Marcel Dupree is one of those writers that I notice often when we covered the indie scene in the past. I covered a couple of his books when we were doing the Chico Comics page together, and he always brought some interesting ideas and characters to the table. But after spending so much time lettering books, I was really interested to see Guido turn his hands to writing comics and how well he realized Dupree's concept on the page. To me, they look like a pretty solid team. So why don't we talk about the story synopsis for this issue, Mike?
Sure. And thanks for the flashback there with the Chico Comics page. I always love remembering that. I must admit that after seeing Guido Martinez's skills at lettering these past few years, I was equally interested in checking out his skills as a writer and a scripter. I would also have to agree that Dupree and Martinez make a good team. In fact, it seems like everyone that worked on Warbound was a pretty good fit. But we'll get into that in more detail in a minute. As to the story synopsis, it can be summed up like this. Is Warbound an immortal anti-hero on a quest for revenge, or a delusional violent super vigilante? Villains fear him. Heroes don't trust him. Now locked in Barrenwood's asylum for the empowered and insane, his only chance at freedom is an evaluation session with Dr. Kendra Jones. I think the setup for this story is really nice. Warbound getting interrogated for the things he's done is the perfect box to tell Warbound's origin story and purpose in. And while I might have structured a couple of sentences differently, the dialogue really tells the story well and very organically. I was eager to turn each page.
Yeah, I think I'm with you on that. I admit I like the basic setup for Warbound's origin story. We really don't often deal with superheroes being psychoanalyzed for the most part. I mean, sure, you have Arkham Asylum over in the Bat books and Dr. Leonard Sampson treating the Hulk and doing psychiatric evaluations for X Factor, but that's usually as far as it goes for the most part. I do get the feeling that Warbound is a case like Rorschach of I'm not locked in here with you, you're locked in here with me. but that's fine for a setup. That's really cool. And honestly, a psych eval like this would be a realistic possibility when dealing with a complete loose cannon anti-hero like a Warbound or a Punisher. Although, to be honest, Warbound is probably more like Conan, who doesn't fit into a civilized society at all and lives by his own rules.
You know, I kind of related that to Warbound's connection with the whole village. They had a connection with nature. You know, there's a harmony to nature, but it's also very savage. You know, even in that panel where Warbound is saying that his village lived in harmony with nature, we see Warbound hucking a spear through a crocodile, which is quite a feat, I might add, considering their armor.
Oh yeah, that was a really cool detail, which shows how tough he was, even when he was mortal. But it also gives a sense of how hard their lives in that village really were. There is also a sense of a wider universe that Warbound belongs to, while also keeping the story centered around Warbound and his past. We get to hear what the other heroes in this world think about him, and it's not kind. People think that he's a jerk, or he's a mental case who needs help, and some heroes are even scared of him. While I can totally understand why heroes would have problems working with him, it's also true that Warbound has been through things that most people can't even imagine. He's an immortal, according to him, who was born in a small tribe, and he can't relate to modern people at all. I ended up liking Warbound by the end of the issue, and I'm interested in learning more about him. Now, I share your concerns about the way the dialogue and narration is structured. I also feel like it could be trimmed or streamlined just a little bit more. But overall, I really enjoyed the story, and I'm interested in these characters and their world, and I want to pick up the second issue. So it did what it intended to do, as far as I'm concerned.
I really liked how Guido hinted at the wider universe as well. I thought that was done in a very clever way, like you said. And actually, I talked to Guido recently, and he said issue number 2 is where things really pick up steam and some major plot points happen. So after reading that first issue and hearing that from Guido, I am with you on wanting to pick up that second issue.
Yep.
But if I could switch gears here for a minute, I have to comment on that badass cover by Shrivastav and Kamaputra. Shrivastav's pencils and inks are tight, and I love his layout too. This cover actually says a lot about the character, just on a visual level. The first thing you notice, of course, is Warbound holding that burly looking bloody axe and sword, both with very primitive looking handles that make you think that perhaps these are handmade weapons, and they're most likely very old. But this is, of course, in contrast with the more modern looking armor, which speaks of perhaps an extra long life full of war and battle, especially when you consider the entire village that seems to be an inferno in his wake. This is just brilliant storytelling artistry, and props to Marcel Dupree for designing Warbound's look. It is spot on, perfectly in line with his immortal revenge-obsessed character.
Oh, that definitely comes across, and we're definitely agreed on the cover. I think you've nailed it here. The layout of the cover definitely makes me think of a barbarian story, which ties into the Conan vibes I get from Warbound. But at the same time, you get a feel of Warbound as a tribal warrior as well, with the sword and the armor, and that helps to set him apart. I typically like a cover that tells a story, or at least hints at what the book is. And while I don't think this cover necessarily covers every angle of the story, I think it gives you just enough of the character that I don't mind that. Even if he might be an immortal living in the modern world, Warbound is stuck at a single point in time, the massacre of his village. The cover conveys that pretty well, I'd say. And I have to agree that this character design is great. I mean, Warbound just looks huge, imposing, and badass.
He really does. And Shrivastav's pencils and Kamaputra's colors really work together on that cover. I'm particularly impressed with the burning village in the background. Fire is tricky to do. And I'm not saying that the pencils and colors aren't brilliant on the rest of the cover. They are. Just that the fire is done so well, and particularly because of the coloring, that you can practically feel the heat coming from it. It's one of the best depictions I've seen of a huge fire, and I think that's because of Kamaputra's colors, that they just shine there. But even that burning village speaks volumes about Warbound's character. I obviously don't know just looking at the cover, but with that being a village in the background, I gotta believe there was more than just fighters in there. I get the feeling there were children and elderly there as well, which means Warbound at least can be a heartless and cold killer.
Oh, I definitely agree on the technical craft of the cover, which is indeed very good. But I would interpret the scene a little bit differently. I didn't get the feeling that Warbound was the one who killed all those people, although he is a cold-blooded killer. My impression was that this is Warbound walking away from the ashes of his village after the sorcerer destroyed it. The hero being forged by the fires of tragedy, as it were. But in fairness, I don't doubt that Warbound would ravage an entire village to get to his hated enemy if that's what it takes to get his vengeance. Still, a scene you can interpret in different ways means that it's a cover with real depth, and I can't argue with that.
I had actually originally thought that Warbound was walking away from his village too, until I read in the issue itself, on that kind of montage page of his history. It looks like he acquires the armor later on, though the first issue does not specify where the armor came from. Did you pick up on something else there?
No, nothing specific. I just figured it was an artistic license thing. Showing the character as he looks like now, set against the world he came from and the tragedy and endured. I mean, that's a perfectly fair technique if that was the idea they were going for.
Oh yeah, totally. I hadn't thought of that, but that does make sense. And describing his journey does seem to be the theme of the rest of the cover. Either way, it turned out well, and I kind of like that it's somewhat ambiguous. But if we could get into scripter Guido Martinez's lettering on Warbound number 1. I feel like Guido had good balloon and caption placement throughout the issue. If there is one flaw, and this is really a very minor issue and honestly unavoidable on the page it happens on, but I would say that on one page there is this intense close-up of Warbound and Dr. Kendra's faces that would have been better to read in print. You know, when you're reading digitals, you don't always get to see the lettering at the bottom of the page until you scroll down to it. So when I originally read it, read the words there, it was out of order, and I actually had to go back and reread it in the proper order when I scrolled down and saw the words down there. But like I said, in the printed copy, this would never have been an issue, and with the close up, there was no other way to do it. It's really the fault of digital comics more than Guido's lettering.
Yeah, I can see where that makes sense. And definitely, when it comes to digital formatting, you do tend to see a loss of translation. So I can see where that would have happened here. But generally, Guido always delivers on the lettering every time. And I can't really fault his stylistic choices on the page for the most part. I mean, he had a fair amount of script on the page, which he wrote, but he knows where to place the captions and the balloons so that the art can tell the story. The dead air in the panels is filled in the right places too. And there was one panel though where I wish the dialogue wasn't covering the file that was in the frame, because I felt like there might have been some interesting details there. But I think that Guido does a good job of managing the space on the page overall, both in the way he plans out each panel and the way he fills in space. As he's both the writer and the letterer, he's able to use those two hats to his advantage on the page. And I think that he does that well.
You know, I had a similar feeling about that panel with the file. You know, it gives you just these little half words and a little things on the end there, and you're like, what? I want to see more. But I mean, when Dr. Kendra Jones asks him to confirm, deny, or maybe even just elaborate on his powers, he essentially tells her that she's gonna have to go with what's in the file she has. That scene's got me thinking that Guido covered up that file on purpose so that maybe his full list of powers could be explored later.
That's a fair point. I mean, that's certainly a reasonable possibility. I guess we'll see in the upcoming issues what that's all about.
For sure, for sure. As for Warbound's character, I found out as I read through the story that the cover is misleading, as is Warbound's reputation that you read from the others. There's a good man inside of that murderous outer shell, even if his black and white view of the world allows him to cross lines that maybe he shouldn't be doing. But I mean, if I was gonna rate this story overall, I'd give this short comic a solid 4.5 out of 5. I think.
That sounds pretty fair. Warbound is definitely a misunderstood character, but I can understand why. If Conan were alive and active in the modern day, he'd be treated like a monster, and that's what we have here. Warbound is an honorable man, and in his time and culture, he'd be seen as a hero for what he does. But he comes from a world with a very different value system, one that would be harshly rejected today. Because of that, the other heroes, and probably even Kendra, come away thinking that he's a psycho. He's a relic of a world that has left him behind. And I think I understand why he'd be done with life once his mission is done. I mean, he has nothing to live for but his vengeance. It's, the whole who wants to live forever problem. Because of all that, Warbound is a tragic character when you stop and think about it, and I really appreciated that part of the story. I'd probably give the issue closer to 4.4 or so, but I think 4.5 is absolutely a fair score. I like what this issue does a lot. I think everybody involved does a good job with it. It raises a lot of interesting questions, and Warbound is the kind of character I do like. I definitely recommend picking it up if it sounds like your kind of book.
I would recommend Warbound #1 as well. But as for the final decision, for those watching this review, Steve and I have given Warbound #1 an average score of 4.45 out of 5. And if you like the sound of that, I recommend following the publisher on Twitter at Evoluzione Pub. That's EVOLUZIONEPUB. Because as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, they have a Kickstarter coming next month on June 8th for Warbound issue #4. And you're not going to want to miss that. I hope you've enjoyed our review of Warbound #1. And I hope that you'll turn in next month for our second Indie Comics review episode.